Even before I reached adolescence, I knew there was something different about me, and I had this longing, and somehow the longing was connected with men. And then as soon as I reached adolescence, I knew I was attracted to men. And somehow the way all gay people know this, you just know somehow intuitively that you can't let anybody know about how you feel. And it was more of a kind of a thing back then because nobody talked about being gay. I reached my adolescence in the 60s and nobody talked much about being gay, and people would joke about homos and stuff, but I knew that I couldn't tell anybody about this. And then I remember the first time I heard the word homosexual was from my older brother. We were talking about something and he used the word and I said, "What's that?" And he said that it's men that have sex with other men, and a light bulb went off in my head. I went, "Oh, I'm a member of a group." Because I think this is not at all uncommon for back then young gay people not to realize that there are other gay people. And me being the way I am, I needed to find out more about this. And so I went to the local library and I looked up the word homosexual in the card catalog. Back then they had card catalogs. And I wrote down the call numbers of a number of books. I didn't write the titles next to them, but just the call numbers. And I went, because I didn't want anyone to see what I was looking up. And I went to the shelves and I couldn't find, they were missing. The books I was looking for was missing. So I went to the librarian and I said, "I can't find these books." And she said, "They're in the locked bookcase." And of course that immediately, I said, "Okay, never mind." But being a smart kid, I knew that they wouldn't lock up the periodicals. And so I went to the Periodical Guide to Literature, which was the internet of the time. It was like 30 volumes where they printed all kinds of different subjects, and they'd tell you what. You'd look up homosexual and it said like Life magazine 1965, January 1965. So I looked up some of these articles. Most of them were just abominable, just like saying the most horrible things. But I'm different from most gay people even today. I don't know why, and I'm not praising myself because of this, but I never internalized self-hatred. I knew even at the tender age of 13 that the entire world was wrong, that there was nothing wrong with me. And as soon as I went off to college, I left Pennsylvania when I was 17 to go off to school. One of the first things I did was go to meetings of the Maher Society, which was like a 1950s, 1940s group of gay people, I think both men and women, but mostly men, that worked for gay rights. And by and large, I mean, they did incredible work for the time. I mean, this was the Joseph McCarthy era where, gay people were, they did amazing things. This was the Joseph McCarthy era where, like being gay was like, not a small matter. But by and large, they were closeted. They used synonyms, and it just didn't sit right with me. And then after Stonewall happened, there started to be gay groups that formed across the country. And I and a friend of mine started our group at Northwestern University, and I think it was the 5th gay group in the country. And we started, doing activist things. We were recognized as a group by the university, and we got some funding, and we held demonstrations. We closed down the most popular bar in Chicago for 2 weekends by demonstrating in front of it until they agreed to get a dancing license and fix their air conditioner. The gay bars were horrible because they had no reason to be nice, because they were a captive audience. They were all corrupt. They were either owned by the mob or they paid off the police to stay open, and they were constantly going through busts, and they'd bust people and arrest people and publish their names in the newspaper, and just ruin lives. So that was a very heady time, and I remained quite an activist for a while. I had a letter published in the New York Times at the age of 18 about the boys in the band. This woman wrote in talking about what a horrible subject this was and why are we talking about it, and I wrote her quite an amazing letter for an 18-year-old.
Awesome.
Yeah, I call those the dark and terrifying years. It was terrible. I was living in New York at the time, and I had a partner. And people began to get sick and die, and they didn't even know how you got it at first. And I fell in love with a great guy, and we had a great relationship for something short of 10 years, and he had HIV. We only had safe sex from the start, and he was always very assiduous about making sure that I stayed healthy. But because we didn't know how it was transmitted, our sex life was very fulfilling but very circumscribed. And he was very, very careful not to infect me. But one after another, my friends died. You found out you were HIV positive, and it was a death sentence. And it was just one funeral after another. Just these beautiful young men just wasting away and dying. And he got sick, and he died. And it was the worst thing. In everyone's life, there are really great things that happen to you and really terrible things that happen to you. So you can take all the terrible things that happened to me, you take the second worst one, and if that was this high, David's death was this high. It was pretty devastating, and it took me quite a while to recover from it. If I am recovered from it now, I don't think I am, but it certainly doesn't carry the pain that it used to carry. It made no difference to me. First of all, my parents were not particularly religious. They made the kind of gestures at religion that every parent kind of feels that they need to if they're not religious. They never, I don't never remember admonishing us about we don't drink and we don't do this. And both of my father died before I came out to him. Although he always liked the gay friends when I brought them around. He always, and they liked him. And then I came out to my mother, and she was very, very supportive, and they're Muslims. My mother, as she got older, she got more religious and quite devout, but she was one of the most kind, loving, and liberal persons that I've ever known. Everyone adored my mother. And I'm sure my father, had I told him, would have, he would have had to have a period of adjustment, but he would have come around to it. None of my parents' my mother's Muslim friends seemed to mind. They all knew I was gay, and none of the Muslim people that I know minded. Now, that's not to say there isn't a lot of homophobia among Muslims, but there's no more, I insist, no more homophobia among Muslims than there are among Christians or Jews. You find Orthodox Jews, you find evangelical Christians, they're all crazy, and they're all homophobic, but that is not my experience. And David was taken in by my family we couldn't get married back then, but my nieces and nephews called him Uncle David, and my brothers, I have 3 brothers, they all loved him, and his passing caused my mother the same kind of grief that it caused me. She was there in the apartment the day that he died. She was a source of great support for me. As a matter of fact, she said one of the most wonderful things, I was driving her back from New York to Pennsylvania after the funeral, and we're traveling along a little quiet, and she goes, Maher, I'm really proud of you. And I said, oh yeah, why, Mom? And she said, because you fulfilled your obligation to David. In other words, she saw our relationship as being that genuine, that not only were we in love, but because we were in love, I had an obligation to take care of him when he was ill. And, that's my mother, the Muslim, okay? So that's not the stereotype. Well, it's interesting because many years ago, when I was an undergraduate in the Gay Liberation Group at Northwestern, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, someday being gay is going to be normal, and we'll be able to walk down the street hand in hand, and nobody will think anything of it. And he said, oh, that's never going to happen, that's never going to happen, and I insisted it would. What is interesting is that today, a male is capable of marrying a male. That is totally permitted. And yet, it's still not possible for 2 men to walk down the street with their hands in each other's hand and feel safe, except in some very constricted neighborhoods, which is interesting. The next thing that has to happen for the gay movement is, and I'm sad to say it, and it's putting it rather brutally, but all the old people that have these old ideas have to die. This is my generation, and my generation was the hippie generation, and my generation was the people I associated with, the people that were progressive, were very progressive and liberal about it and very open to it. But there's a lot of old people now that just carry these really destructive ideas, and they're going to die. And it's the 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, my nieces and nephews, who just don't care. My nephew, who just recently got married to his boyfriend, they don't care. What the next move is for these old people and their old ideas to die and rid the world of the kind of plague that they inflict on people. You take adolescence, you take kids, adolescence is a difficult enough period as it is. You take a 13-year-old who believes in God and goes to church and sits in church and hears the priest or the pastor tell him that he is going to burn in hell forever for something that he is. And that causes a great deal of damage and dysfunction. And it's mean, it's cruel, it's not Christian, it's not Jewish, it's not Muslim, it's not godlike. It has nothing to do with God. It is profoundly evil, and these evil ideas are going to die. They are just going to die.